Have you ever noticed how sometimes the very people we help the most are the ones who end up despising us? It feels like a cruel paradox. The more sacrifice you make, the less recognition you get. I learned that the hard way. My own son, the boy I raised through sweat and sleepless nights, told me to disappear from his life. He said I was an embarrassment. The sting of those words cut deep. That kind of humiliation doesn't fade easily. But life has a strange, ironic way of turning the tables. Months later, it was him who knocked on my door. The high-powered attorney, with his luxury cars and overseas vacations, suddenly needed something only I had, the $75,000 I'd quietly saved over the years. He swallowed his pride and came to ask for help, but what he didn't know was how I would respond. Because by then, it wasn't about money anymore. It was about respect, about dignity, and about a revenge no one saw coming. But before I tell you what happened, I need to ask you something. Leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button. It may seem like a small gesture, but every comment is proof that respect within a family isn't a luxury, it's a right. I never imagined that at 61 years old, after a lifetime of hard work, I would be cast out of my own son's life in front of cameras, reporters, and complete strangers. And the stage for my humiliation wasn't a family dinner table, as you might expect. No, it was the polished, glittering auditorium where Christopher, my firstborn, was celebrating the grand opening of his new law office. The space had glass walls, sleek chandeliers, and waiters in spotless uniforms serving champagne, a perfect setting for his triumph. But for me, it became the stage of my greatest shame. I was there more as a spectator than a father. I wore my old suit, the same one I'd worn at his wedding, now a bit snug around the waist, a little frayed at the cuffs, but still carrying the quiet dignity of a simple man who valued education and respect above all. At first, no one even seemed to notice I was there. I stood in the back, holding on to my old chef's hat, a habit of mine, a reminder of who I was and what I had built. While people toasted to success, all I could think of were the long nights, the smell of onions frying at 2 in the morning, and the endless bills I struggled to pay while Chris was still in school. And in that very setting of luxury and pride, the betrayal took place. In the middle of his thank you speech, Christopher spotted me in the crowd. He paused, adjusted the microphone, and instead of smiling, acknowledging the father who had sacrificed everything for him, he said something that ripped me apart. "Ladies and gentlemen, that man in the back, that's my father. But I'd like to publicly ask him to leave. I don't want him to be part of this moment. He is an embarrassment to me." The room went ice cold. Guests coughed, looked away, fumbled with their glasses to hide their discomfort, but no one dared say a word. Can you imagine the weight of those words? It wasn't just the shame of being called an embarrassment. It was the violence of being erased from his life at the very moment that should have been about celebration. It was as if he had taken an eraser and scrubbed me out, right there in front of everyone. And it hurt because it wasn't only about me. It was about family, about a bond I thought was unbreakable. In that instant, it felt like the sacred tie between father and son was shattered like a plate hitting the floor, impossible to mend. The strange part is, right then I realized something bigger. Often the ones who betray us aren't distant enemies, but the very people who should be protecting our name and our story. The cruelest betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from within our own walls. And maybe you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe a brother who turned his back, a child who dismissed your sacrifices, a childhood friend who pretended not to know you once they reached a higher status. These are the kinds of wounds that leave invisible scars, because they cut right into our dignity and our sense of belonging. I could have shouted back. I could have confronted him in front of everyone. But instead, I took a deep breath and stayed silent. I held my old chef's hat tight against my chest, like a shield, and I walked out. Not because I was weak, but because I had learned something. Some battles aren't won in the heat of the moment. They're won in the patience of time. Revenge, when it's just, doesn't need to be loud. It builds in silence, step by step, until the day the betrayer realizes his downfall began the very moment he thought he was untouchable. As I walked to the exit, I could feel the stares, some pitying, some even contemptuous, but I refused to let myself cry there. Because deep down, a voice inside whispered, "This isn't the end. This is only the beginning of a new story." Maybe you need to hear that too. When you're humiliated, don't see it as a period. See it as a comma, because what comes after can be far more powerful if you know how to turn pain into fuel. And I knew, even bleeding inside, that this wound would be the start of my liberation. It's funny, but life is a lot like a professional kitchen. Sometimes the dish that comes out burned is exactly the one that teaches you not to make the same mistake again. That day, Christopher burned me in front of everyone, but I held on to every second, every look of disdain, every word he spoke echoing in that hall, not to play the victim, but to quietly prepare a recipe he'd never forget. Because if that night he decided to erase me from his life, I knew that the past I carried, the sacrifices, the sweat, the years, would still have their day of revelation. Sometimes when I look back, I realize life isn't made only of big victories. It's made of countless nights when no one is watching. The audience only sees the bright stage lights, but ignores what happens backstage. And the backstage of my life was hot, suffocating, and smelled of garlic sizzling in olive oil. I worked overnight shifts in industrial kitchens, preparing banquets I could never afford to taste myself. It was me, the stove, the endless pile of dishes, and one stubborn hope, to give my son the chance to live a life different from mine. Working in restaurants isn't like people imagine. It doesn't come with the glamour of TV shows or French music. In the background, it's sweat dripping down your face, pots that feel like they weigh a ton, burns on your hands, cuts that don't even get the chance to heal. I remember one night, after 16 hours straight, I sat in the back of the restaurant eating leftovers from a customer's plate. It was that or go hungry. And no, I didn't feel shame. I felt purpose, because every bite of that cold, overcooked meal reminded me, hang in there, Thomas. Tomorrow you'll pay for another one of Chris's college books. Maybe you felt that too, working in a job you don't love, but that you need. Maybe you've worked overtime in silence, not because you wanted recognition, but because you knew that extra paycheck would make a difference for someone you love. That's what sacrifice truly is. It isn't about erasing yourself. It's about building, brick by brick, something bigger than yourself. I sacrificed my sleep, my aching back, even my own dreams, to make sure my son had a future built on dignity. One of the strongest memories I carry is the day I sold my collection of professional knives. For a chef, knives aren't just tools, they're extensions of your hands. I had rare Japanese blades, sharp as razors, collected over decades. Each one told a story. The first restaurant I ever worked in, the first big Christmas feast I prepared alone, the dish that earned me a round of applause from an entire table. One day, I looked at that collection and thought, either I hold on to my pride or I invest in my son's future. I sold them all, and with that money, I paid Christopher's overdue law school tuition. You know what's curious? He never knew about it. And maybe that's the essence of real sacrifice, doing without expecting applause. In life, what truly transforms us isn't what people see, but what we do when no one is watching. I never needed him to thank me. All I wanted was for him to go further, to reach a freedom I never had. But life has its ironies. While I was proud to see my son become a lawyer, inside I carried the weight of slowly fading away. Sacrifice also means giving up simple moments. How many times did I skip a parent-teacher meeting because I was covering an extra shift? How many Christmases did I spend in the restaurant kitchen, preparing feasts for families I didn't even know, while my own family gathered without me? Those are invisible prices, but they're steep. And I don't say this to earn pity, far from it. I say it to remind you that every achievement, too, carries a bill. And those who have sacrificed know this bill is paid in silent nights, in hidden tears, and in dreams postponed. It's like planting a fruit tree. You water it, care for it, protect it from the frost, but you know you might never taste the ripe fruit yourself. Your children will, maybe even their children. That's how it was for me. The restaurant was never mine. The big house was never mine. But every plate I served was a drop in the bucket filling Christopher's future. I laid the foundation. He was supposed to build the castle, but in truth, his castle was built on the bones of my story. And here's something you might take with you. Sacrifice only makes sense when it's tied to purpose. If you sacrifice for nothing, the weight becomes unbearable. But when you know where you're headed, even pain tastes like hope. I didn't read many books, but one that stayed with me was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." That thought carried me through burned pans, abusive bosses, and shifts that bordered on exploitation. My why had a name, a last name, and was sitting in a law school classroom. But see, life is ironic, because sometimes you give everything and still get ingratitude in return. That doesn't erase the sacrifice. If anything, it strengthens its value. If today you work hard for someone and feel unappreciated, don't lose heart.
recognition isn't always immediate. It doesn't always come from the person
you expected. Many times it comes from those around you, or even from within, in the form of peace, because dignity is knowing you did the right thing, even when no one clapped for you. That night when I was thrown out of my son's event, the humiliation seemed to crush everything I had ever done. But deep inside, I knew every sacrifice had been worth it, because the man I became wasn't built on his gratitude, but on the quiet strength I had accumulated through a lifetime. And that strength, soon, he would discover in the bitterest way possible. After all, every ignored sacrifice eventually becomes the seed of a turning point. When my son ordered me out of that auditorium, calling me an embarrassment, many expected me to react. Some waited for a shout, a fist pounding the table, or at least a few words of outrage to prove I still had fire in my veins. But none of that came. What came from me was silence. And that silence wasn't cowardice. It was the highest form of resistance I knew. Because some pains, if turned into words, would be volcanoes destroying everything in their path. I didn't want destruction. Deep down, I was saving my strength for another kind of revenge. Colder, sharper, and far more just. I remember pressing my old chef's hat against my chest. It was the symbol of my story, a piece of my identity Christopher never respected. I walked toward the door, hearing the whispers, feeling the sideways glances, catching the heavy sighs of those who felt ashamed for me, but not enough to defend me. It's strange how public betrayal silences not only the victim but also the witnesses. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to confront the man in the expensive suit. And right there, in the middle of all that indifference, I learned that dignity is often a lonely choice. Megan, my youngest daughter, was the only one who ran after me. I still remember the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway. She hugged me like someone trying to piece back together a shattered vase. "Dad, I will never turn my back on you," she said, and that simple, direct sentence felt like a thread of hope in the middle of a shipwreck. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her and realized that while one child chose humiliation, another gave me liberation. Sometimes life balances itself like that. Betrayal on one side, raw emotion on the other. And in that contrast, we grasp both the beauty and the pain of family ties. The truth is, silence stayed with me not only that night but in the days that followed. I'd wake up with no strength to talk about what happened. Neighbors whispered, acquaintances called to ask if it was true. I answered little, and those who've been through this will understand. When you're betrayed, every word feels like another brick in the wall isolating you. Talking too much only feeds the spectacle the world expects, and I wasn't willing to turn my pain into entertainment for the curious. Silence, in that sense, is a form of discipline. It's choosing not to stoop to the level of insult. Have you noticed how the people who lash out the most in anger are often the ones who regret it later? Silence gave me something Christopher never understood: control. He thought he had crushed me with his words, but the truth is, by staying quiet, I kept my dignity intact. It was as if I were saying, "You can try to shame me, but you will never strip away the respect I've built inside myself." That's something no one, not even your own blood, can take from you. In a way, silence is also a strategy for revenge. Sounds strange, but it's true. Think of chess. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't rushing to act. It's waiting, watching, holding the right piece for the right moment. Silence is that. It's the pause before the counterattack, the deep breath before the reversal. And if you've ever been humiliated in front of coworkers, friends, or even within your own family, maybe you've felt the strength of that pause. Silence builds tension, and tension is exactly what sets the stage for the fall of the one who hurt us. With Megan, I learned how to handle the pause better. She would come to my house, bring food, laugh at my old jokes, and remind me that I wasn't alone. One night she said, "Dad, you don't have to defend yourself. The people who know you already know who you are." Those words hit me hard, because deep down, I realized I was trying to fight something impossible: Christopher's pride. There's no argument strong enough to break the pride of someone who sees himself as greater than his own father. Only life can teach that lesson. Only the fall can bring humility. And until that day came, my silence was the seed I watered every single day. Silence, though, doesn't mean the absence of pain. It means choice. I cried alone, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of bitter coffee. I'd stare at the plain walls of my house and think about the luxurious halls where Christopher paraded around with his wife, Lauren. The difference between us was blinding, and yet I never felt envy. What I felt was a mix of sadness and reflection, because I realized more and more that true wealth wasn't in the money he flaunted, but in the ability to look at someone and recognize their worth. And that was exactly what he had lost. In those days, I learned something that may serve you as well. Not every humiliation deserves an immediate response. Sometimes the best form of freedom is learning not to react. That doesn't mean accepting injustice. It means choosing the right moment to act. When you keep silent, you're really preparing the ground to speak louder in the future, not with words, but with actions. I knew my time would come, and when it did, it would be impossible for Christopher to deny everything I stood for, and it was precisely in that contrast between my silence and the noise of his luxurious life that the story began to unfold. While I lived simply, carrying the marks of sacrifice, he surrounded himself with expensive cars, elegant parties, and international trips. The silence I cultivated at home grew heavier and heavier compared to the artificial noise surrounding his life. And sooner or later, I knew that noise would vanish, like smoke, revealing the emptiness he was so desperate to hide. Silence brought me back to my simple routine. My house was small, but every corner carried a memory. The smell of bread baking in the old oven, the sound of the radio playing old songs while I cooked for myself. All of it reminded me that life, when lived with respect and dignity, doesn't need a stage. I brewed my coffee in a dented kettle, seasoned beans the way my mother used to, and felt at peace. It was a humble life, but one filled with genuine emotion. What sustained me wasn't showmanship. It was the sense of being connected to what truly matters. Meanwhile, Christopher lived in another world. Through social media and the newspaper, I saw pictures of him posing with imported cars, expensive watches on his wrist, and traveling to places I only knew by name. He dined in restaurants where a single bottle of wine cost more than my month's worth of groceries. It was a life that glittered, but to me, it was a hollow shine. Because luxury without gratitude isn't greatness, it's just a display case. And display cases, sooner or later, shatter. I remember one scene that stayed with me. While I was preparing a simple stew with vegetables, from the farmer's market, I saw a photo of Christopher at an event, raising a crystal glass in Paris. The caption read, "Victory belongs to the strong." In that moment, I looked at my old aluminum pot, dented and scratched, and thought, maybe he'll never understand that real victory isn't what you show off, but what you build in silence. My pot might not have had dollar value, but it had value in stories. Every scratch a reminder of nights I cooked just to make sure there was food on the table. That contrast between humble living and luxury always made me reflect on family relationships. In many homes, that invisible gap exists. A child achieves material success and forgets the roots. A father or mother sacrifices everything, only to be treated as outdated. It's like a bridge with traffic going only one way. You help them cross, but no one comes back for you. And that's where humiliation lives, not in having less, but in the contempt of those who should recognize the value of every brick you laid in their story. I was never ashamed of my modest life. On the contrary, it carried a sense of liberation. I didn't need to hide debts or pretend to be happy. My table was small, but it was honest. My friends were few, but they were loyal. Christopher, on the other hand, was surrounded by people who applauded him. But I knew those claps were bought, not earned. Deep down, I believed he had traded real emotion for appearances. And appearances, when tested, don't hold. They're like a cake that rises beautifully in the oven, only to collapse the moment you open the door too soon. Maybe you know that feeling too, looking at someone in your family who, after gaining status, seems to have forgotten where they came from. It's painful, but common. What few realize is that luxury doesn't erase fragility, it only hides it. How many times have I seen businessmen go bankrupt behind their luxury cars? How many times have I heard stories of families falling apart while living in mansions? The difference lies in where you build your foundation. If it's on money, any storm can take it down. But if it's on dignity and respect, no betrayal can strip that away. In my humble routine, I found meaning. I planted herbs on the balcony, taught Megan how to cook traditional dishes, and laughed at the little things, like when the radio crackled in the middle of a song. That simplicity was my form of resistance. It was as if I were saying silently, I don't need luxury to prove my worth. While Christopher lost himself in parties and trips, I held on to what truly sustains a man: character. And character isn't bought, it's built. What's most intriguing is that the contrast between us grew each day. Me, living modestly, but with peace. Him, living luxuriously, but under pressure. And it's funny how life charges a high price for poorly managed luxury. Those who climb too fast without strong roots collapse just as quickly. And I knew, deep down, that Christopher's fall wasn't a matter of if, but when. My silence was proof of that. While I stirred my simple soup, he was drunk on a victory that wasn't real yet. That gap between my life and his was the seed of the reversal to come. Because luxury, when tested, needs real foundation. And Christopher, without realizing it, was walking on fragile ground. While he lived off fake applause, I held something worth more than any imported car. 30 years of sacrifice turned into quiet savings. And when the right moment came, that contrast between my humility and his luxury would be the key to the most painful revenge and to my own liberation. Life has a curious way of proving that luxury and arrogance are no shield against reality. When you least expect it, the tide turns, and the one who seemed untouchable suddenly finds himself surrounded by his own fragility. That's exactly what happened with Christopher. Months after my public humiliation, I learned that his law firm, once celebrated in cocktail parties and newspaper columns, was on the brink of collapse. The $1 million contract that held up his image as a rising star attorney was about to slip through his fingers, and just like that, the shine of his life began to fade in front of the very people who once applauded him. I didn't hear about this crisis by accident. The noise of luxury, when it falls silent, echoes louder than any shout. Rumors spread across town. Suppliers unpaid, clients losing trust, partners fighting behind closed doors. From my, modest kitchen, I listened to the news the way you'd check the weather forecast. I knew the storm was coming, because life doesn't let anyone mock the dignity of a father without consequence. When you sow ingratitude, the harvest is always bitter. And there it was, right in front of me. Christopher always believed applause was eternal, but applause that's bought is nothing more than fireworks. Bright for a second, then gone, leaving only smoke. When that $1 million contract started to slip away, he discovered how quickly clapping turns to silence, and silence to abandonment. Friends distanced themselves, partners began to doubt him, and even Lauren, his wife, started looking at him with uncertainty. What once was power had turned into pressure, and pressure reveals character, or the lack of it. I watched from the outside with a calm that almost felt ironic. Not because I wanted to see my son fail, but because I knew life is a teacher no one can fool. His arrogance was finally forced to bow to reality. I've always said, money can buy an expensive watch, but not time. It can pay for a famous lawyer, but not respect. And what Christopher was losing wasn't just money. It was the very respect he mocked when he cast me out of his life. That unexpected turn made me reflect on how falls come for everyone. Maybe you've seen it too. The neighbor who flashed a brand new car, then suddenly moved away when he lost his job. Or that coworker who looked like he had the world at his feet. But one crisis revealed it was all a facade. The truth is, no one is immune to life's tests. And when those tests arrive, only those with strong roots, respect, dignity, and values are able to stand. I remembered an old saying my father used to repeat, "The river flows to the sea, but it's the spring that sustains its course." Christopher had forgotten the spring. He thought the ocean was endless, but he ignored the fact that the waters only reach it if someone opens the way. I was that spring, and when he spat on my dignity, he forgot that one day he might need me again. That's the irony of life. Often, the son who says, "I don't need you," is the very one who, sooner or later, comes knocking at your door for help. And that's exactly what happened. When scandal at his firm became inevitable, Christopher realized he needed a large sum in just a few days. $75,000 to be exact. It was the difference between keeping up the facade of success or watching everything collapse in front of the entire city. For the first time, fate placed him in the same position I had faced countless times, forced to choose between pride and survival. And his choice was to swallow every word he'd thrown at me in that auditorium and come to me. Look at the irony. The same man who called me an embarrassment now needed the strength I had been quietly storing for years. That's when life shows its justice. Because the most painful revenge isn't planned, it builds itself as the natural consequence of bad seeds. Christopher never imagined that his simple father, with dented pots and a modest home, had something neither his partners, nor his wife, nor his luxury cars could offer. Stability. Stability built in silence, with sacrifice, night after night. That moment taught me something profound I want to share with you. Never underestimate the seeds you plant in your life. They may look small, insignificant, even laughable compared to the rush of others. But in time, those very seeds will be the ones that hold you up when everything else fails. I planted quiet savings, watered with sweat, seasoned with hidden tears. Christopher, on the other hand, planted arrogance. And when the harvest came, there was no shade to protect him. The unexpected turn was only beginning, and I knew in silence that the request for help would come. The real question was, how would I handle it? Because this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, respect, and justice. The stage was set, and once again, life was placing me in the position to decide the next chapter of this story. It didn't take long before my door was knocked on with urgency. It was late afternoon, and I was seasoning a roast chicken when I heard the insistent sound. I opened the door, and there was Christopher, impeccable in his expensive suit, but with a face heavy with tension. This wasn't the same proud son from the auditorium. This was a man cornered by circumstances, his pride crushed by necessity. Swallowing hard, he stepped inside and, without ceremony, said, "Dad, I need your help to keep the family's name from being destroyed." In that instant, a storm of emotions ran through me. Imagine the same person who stabbed you in public now showing up at your door, begging for the antidote to the poison he himself planted. It was pure contradiction. He spoke of saving the family name, but forgot he was the first to try erasing me from it. I stayed silent for a few seconds, not because I lacked a response, but because every word he spoke dragged me back to that betrayal. And even so, there I was, standing in front of my own son, fighting not to let bitterness turn into hate. He began explaining. He said the firm was in crisis, that his partners were pressuring him, that Lauren was already afraid of the social fallout. I listened, but it felt like I was hearing a stranger. There was no emotion in his words, only calculation. Christopher wasn't speaking as a son who recognized his father. He was speaking as a lawyer, negotiating. It was a plea disguised as strategy. He used words like honor, family name, tradition. Beautiful words, but empty, coming from someone who had stomped on my dignity without hesitation. And while he spoke, one truth echoed in my mind. There are two kinds of pleas for help. The first comes from a sincere heart, when someone admits they were wrong, bows their head, and asks forgiveness before they ask for help. The second comes from cold calculation, when the person doesn't really want you. They want what you can give. Christopher's plea was clearly the second. He hadn't come seeking his father. He came seeking the vault he imagined I had hidden somewhere. To me, that was just another humiliation, an attempt to turn love into currency. And maybe you've lived something like this yourself. A friend who only calls when they need money. A relative who disappears when life is good but shows up the moment they're in trouble. That hurts, not because of the request itself, but because of the emptiness behind it. It's as if you're reduced to an object of utility, not a person with history, feelings, and sacrifice. And it's exactly in those moments that clarity is needed. Helping can't be automatic. It has to be conscious. Because there's a very fine line between generosity and being made a fool. Christopher, in his rush, tried to convince me with speeches. "Dad, it's just a loan. I'll pay it back. You know that without this, our family name will be ruined. You don't want that, do you?" It was strange hearing that word. Our. Months earlier, I was an embarrassment. Now suddenly it was we. Opportunism dressed up as reconciliation. There was no apology, no remorse, only fear. And fear has never been the foundation of family. What sustains it is respect, dignity, and truth. I looked at him and saw not a son trying to save his family, but a man scrambling to save his image, like an actor desperate to keep the applause going. But I knew the truth. Without a real stage, no performance lasts. And in that moment I realized he still hadn't understood anything. He still believed money would solve it all. But the problem wasn't a lack of money. It was a lack of character. And character can't be bought for $75,000. Even so, inside me there was a battle. The father's heart wanted to help, to reach out, to stop him from sinking. But the wounded, humiliated, betrayed man in me demanded a caution, because I knew giving him the money, just like that, would be like throwing pearls before swine. It wouldn't transform Christopher, only prolong his arrogance, and I wasn't willing to finance another season of contempt. If I were to help him, it would have to be in a way he would never forget. And here's a lesson I carry with me. Not all help truly helps. Sometimes giving is the fastest way to lose even more. Real support is the kind that transforms, not the kind that feeds the cycle of mistakes. Think about this. When someone comes to you asking for something, ask yourself, will this set them free or just keep them chained to the same pattern? Generosity without awareness becomes permissiveness, and permissiveness is betrayal against yourself. That day, while Christopher kept talking, I said only one thing. Come back in a few days. I'll think about it. He was surprised. He expected me to say yes immediately, maybe even thank him for the chance to repair our relationship. But I didn't bend. My voice came out calm, firm, almost serene. He tried to insist, but I repeated, in a few days, and in the silence that followed, I could see something shake inside him. Maybe it was the first time he felt he wasn't in control. He left in a hurry. No hugs, no apologies. He only left behind the scent of his expensive cologne and the echo of his calculated words. I stayed home, sitting at the table, staring at my old financial notebook. I knew I had the money he needed, but I also knew that if I gave it, it had to be turned into a lesson. Because revenge, when it's born from self-respect, isn't destruction, it's teaching. And my answer, when it came, wouldn't be just about saving or denying. It would be about showing who had truly learned the meaning of dignity. When Christopher walked out my door that afternoon, with $75,000 hanging from his lips, I stayed alone in my kitchen. The roast chicken I had seasoned grew cold on the table, but the truth is hunger had no place in me anymore. What I felt was a mix of pain and clarity. I knew his request was hypocritical, but I also knew life had finally handed me a rare opportunity. It was like holding a brand new chef's knife. I could use it to repeat the same old cuts, or to prepare a dish that would forever change the flavor of my story. In the days that followed, I kept silent. I didn't talk to neighbors, didn't mention it to friends, didn't share it with anyone. Megan, who had already, noticed something, was the only one brave enough to ask, "Dad, what did Chris want?" I just smiled and said he came to talk. She didn't push. Maybe she sensed I already had something in mind. The truth is, inside I was turning over every detail. I had the money, but handing over that sum thoughtlessly would be like giving fine wine to someone who can't even tell it apart from tap water. Silence in those days was my greatest ally. I woke up early, made my coffee, scribbled numbers into an old notebook, and reflected on life. Each page was more than just figures. It was the memory of nights I cooked for strangers at luxury banquets, of dishes I never tasted myself, of tips that turned into savings carefully set aside. It was as if every dollar saved carried a story, and giving that money to Christopher without thought would be a betrayal of the sacrifices that had brought me this far. The decision matured slowly, like bread dough rising under a cloth. I thought, if I just hand it over, I feed his arrogance. If I refuse, I risk losing him forever. But what if there was a third way? What if I could turn that money into a symbol, a lesson, a turning point? That's when I realized, true revenge isn't about saying yes or no. It's about using what you have to teach, to mark, to leave a scar that never fades. Megan noticed my silence. Sometimes she watched me closely, like she was trying to decipher a secret recipe. "Dad, you've already decided, haven't you?" she asked one night while washing dishes beside me. I only shook my head and said, "It's not time yet." That silence was heavy, but it was also freeing, because for the first time, it wasn't Christopher setting the rules. It was me, and there was something deeply just in that, reversing the roles without shouting, just by waiting for the right moment. And maybe that's the greatest lesson I can leave you with. Not every decision needs to be announced right away. Life requires strategy. When you're humiliated, the temptation is to react instantly, but true victory lives in quiet preparation. It's like cooking on low heat. The aroma takes time to spread, but when it does, it's irresistible. I knew that when Christopher came back for my answer, he would have no idea what I was about to serve. And so, in the days leading up to our next encounter, I held my plan close, like a chef guards a secret recipe. Every detail was ready, every gesture rehearsed. I didn't need words anymore. I only needed to wait for the right moment to reveal that silence is never the absence of an answer. It's the announcement that something far greater is on its way. The day finally came. I woke up early, just like in the old restaurant days when I had to prepare everything before the chaos began. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. But this wasn't just another morning. This was the day my silence would turn into a voice. I grabbed my old leather briefcase, worn, scratched, but tough like me, and placed inside the document that carried 30 years of my life. The savings account statement showing $75,000. It wasn't just money. It was sweat, sleepless nights, knives sold, holidays missed. It was my sacrifice on paper. When I arrived at Christopher's office, the air was heavy. He had called not only Lauren, his wife, but also 2 of his senior partners. The conference room was imposing. Glass table, padded chairs, a skyline view. I walked in with steady steps, wearing my old suit, the same one he had mocked months before. But this time, I wasn't a humiliated man. I was someone carrying in my hands the key to a turning point. Christopher tried to control the scene. "Dad, I'm glad you came. We need to resolve this quickly," he said, forcing a smile that barely hid his nerves. Lauren wouldn't meet my eyes, and the partners just sat there, stern, like judges ready to deliver a verdict. I sat calmly, placed the briefcase on the table, and let a few seconds of silence stretch. I had learned that sometimes silence weighs more than any word. Everyone expected me to say yes right away, but I already knew the answer that would change everything would come slowly, like a knife sliding through butter. I opened the briefcase and showed the statement. I saw Christopher's eyes light up for a moment, relief washing over his face. He exhaled, convinced he was saved. But before he could say a word, I closed the briefcase again. "This money exists, Christopher, but it isn't for you. It's for Megan, for her to open the restaurant she's always dreamed of." The room went silent. It was as if the air had been sucked out. Lauren's mouth fell open. The partners exchanged glances. And Christopher just froze. The emotion of that instant can't be put into simple words. It was as if every year of sacrifice, every night of humiliation and silence had finally found its turning point. I didn't shout. I didn't pound the table. I didn't lose my composure. I simply announced my decision with serenity. Megan was with me every step of the way. She never called me an embarrassment, never asked me to disappear. She deserves to be recognized. This money is for her, because by her side, I found respect and dignity. Every word cut the air like a blade, slicing Christopher's pride in front of everyone. He lost control. "You can't do this. That money is mine by right. I'm your oldest son. I'm a lawyer," he shouted, his voice climbing higher. But the partners, watching closely, saw in that desperation the truth he'd always tried to hide. Behind the expensive suit was only a dependent, insecure, arrogant man. Lauren sank back in her chair, embarrassed, and I stayed firm, the briefcase in my hands, not just holding papers, but the story of an entire life. At that moment, I realized something profound. The most powerful revenge doesn't humiliate with screaming, but with undeniable truth. I didn't need to remind him of the words he threw at me in the auditorium, or the pain he caused. The simple act of denying him the money, right there in front of the people he most wanted to impress, was enough to strip away his mask. The rising star attorney, praised in society columns, was standing there begging the father he had shamed, and there was no better audience to witness his fall. I looked at Megan, who was by my side. Her eyes were wet, but shining with gratitude. It was as if she was saying without words, "Dad, at last you've been seen." And in a way, she was right. I wasn't just opening a path for her. I was reclaiming my own dignity. That money, which could have fueled another one of Christopher's lies, was now a symbol of justice. And justice, when born from pain, is always liberating. I stood slowly, closed the briefcase, and said, "My decision is final." There was no discussion, no negotiation. I simply left the room with my head held high. As I walked out, I could hear Christopher's voice collapsing into pleas, begging, grasping, trying to regain a control he would never hold again. And I, in silence, smiled on the inside. Not a smile of mockery, but of release. Because for the first time, I felt my simple life had become the lesson he would never forget. Christopher had always believed he could control any situation with the power of his voice. But that day, in front of his partners, his wife and me, his tone of authority turned into panic. I watched his face contort as he realized he wouldn't get the money. His eyes, once full of arrogance, now trembled like those of a lost child. He shouted, waved his arms, slammed the table. But the louder he got, the faster his mask fell away. And the partners, who once applauded him, now stared with cold eyes, like gamblers who knew they had backed the wrong horse. Lauren said nothing. She just crossed her arms and looked away. The disappointment on her face was visible, almost tangible. She no longer saw the brilliant attorney parading at gala events. She saw a desperate man begging the father he had once called an embarrassment. It was a cruel silence, but a necessary one. Because in that contrast, the truth finally revealed itself. Christopher had no control, no allies. He was alone in his downfall. I never raised my voice. I simply stood firm, watching. Life often teaches us that you don't need to push someone who's already falling. You just need to step aside. And that's what I did. I let Christopher face the weight of his own choices in front of us. Those who mattered most to him, his wife, his partners, his own conscience. The humiliation he once gave me in public came back to him, doubled. Not because I caused it, but because arrogance always exacts its price. As I walked out of that room, I heard his desperate calls fading behind me. Dad, please, don't do this to me. But there was nothing left I could do, or should do. The respect he lost couldn't be bought with money. The dignity he destroyed couldn't be rebuilt in an afternoon. His, fall was no longer my responsibility. It was only the inevitable consequence of having despised the man who built the foundation of his story. And as I left, Megan by my side, I felt a strange peace. Not joy at his defeat, but relief at life's justice. Because in that moment, I finally understood. The greatest revenge is not destroying someone. It's letting them face the mirror of their own choices. And Christopher, at last, was standing before his. When I walked out of that office, something inside me broke, and at the same time, something was rebuilt. For years, I carried the weight of betrayal and humiliation. But in that instant, I realized I was no longer a prisoner of my son's judgment. I wasn't leaving as a defeated man. I was leaving as someone who had turned pain into justice. The cold air outside hit my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe freely, as if I had finally set down a burden too heavy to carry. Megan wrapped her arms around me, holding me tight. Her eyes said more than words ever could. Gratitude, pride, love. I knew that moment was worth more than any sum of money. She had been my quiet partner through all of this, and now she was living proof that my sacrifice had not been in vain. For the first time, I felt that someone in my own family truly saw me, not as a burden, not as an embarrassment, but as a father who gave everything he had. As we walked together, I thought of Christopher. Inside, he was crying, begging, but it was already too late. Life has a hard way of teaching lessons. When respect is lost, regret always arrives too late. I didn't wish for his destruction, but I knew he needed this moment to understand that dignity can't be bought, can't be negotiated. My true liberation wasn't in denying him the money. It was in denying the power he once held over me. For the first time, I wasn't the silenced man of humiliation. I was the man who chose how the story would end. It's strange how, when we let go of the past, something inside us realigns. I no longer needed Christopher's approval. I didn't need applause, public recognition, or late apologies. What I needed was already there, in Megan's embrace, in the serenity of my conscience, and in the certainty that my life, simple and full of sacrifice, had become a symbol of respect and freedom. That is the kind of victory no one can steal, the peace of knowing you stayed true to yourself. And as we walked home, hand in hand, I thought, the circle was complete. Christopher may have lost the contract, the partners, maybe even his marriage, but I had regained something infinitely greater, my dignity. And that, I knew, was a legacy that not even time could erase. You know what this story taught me? That no betrayal can erase the value of a life built on respect, dignity, and sacrifice. Sometimes we are humiliated by our own family, treated like a burden, reduced to nothing. But the truth is, time always reveals who truly carries strength and who was only hiding behind a mask. So let me ask you, how many times have you stayed silent just to keep your peace? How many times have you carried pain in your chest, waiting in silence for life to give the answer? Maybe it's time to turn that pain into fuel for your own freedom. Because it's not revenge itself that matters. It's the awareness that no one has the right to take away your respect. I want you to reflect. If today were the day of your turning point, what would your answer be? Would you keep letting yourself be diminished? Or would you use the power of your story as proof that no one can erase who you are? Think about that, and tell me in the comments, what was the moment when your dignity was most put to the test? Your experience could inspire others here. And of course, don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because with every video you watch, every comment you leave, we're building something greater together. A community where emotion, respect, and family are treated the way they should be, with truth.